The ceramic serving bowl was still warm in my hands when my husband destroyed 35 years of marriage with 7 words. Emily always was the dead weight in this family. The bowl, my grandmother's prized possession, slipped from my fingers, hitting the polished hardwood floor of our dining room with a sound like a gunshot. Rich, dark gravy, the recipe I'd spent 2 days perfecting, splattered across the Persian rug James's mother had given us for our 10th anniversary. The same rug I'd hand-cleaned twice a year for 25 years. The same rug where our children had taken their first steps, where we'd unwrapped Christmas presents and celebrated graduations and pretended, for so very long, that we were happy. The laughter started immediately. My son, David, 32 and far too much like his father, snorted into his wine glass. My daughter, Sophia, covered her mouth, but I could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Even my youngest, Michael, just turned 27, was grinning as he helped himself to another scoop of my triple cheese macaroni. But it was my daughter-in-law, Olivia, who laughed the loudest, throwing her head back like James had just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. "Oh my God, James, that's terrible," she gasped between giggles. "But so accurate." I stood frozen beside the table I'd spent 2 days preparing, wearing the apron I'd embroidered with our family initials, surrounded by the people I'd devoted my entire adult life to serving. The honey-glazed ham I'd been basting since 4 in the morning sat golden and perfect in the center of the table. The homemade rolls were still warm from the oven. The sweet potato casserole with the pecan brown sugar topping that took 3 hours to prepare properly steamed gently in its crystal dish. My grandmother's crystal dish. The one I'd promised myself I'd pass down to Sophia someday. All of it ignored while my family laughed at the joke that was my life. "Dead weight," James repeated, savoring the words like a fine whiskey. He'd learned the phrase from some motivational podcast he was obsessed with. "That's what you are, Emily. Always have been. Dragging us all down with your little hobbies and your crazy ideas." The crazy idea he was referring to had been mentioned exactly once, tentatively, hopefully, during the appetizer course. A small, high-end wilderness retreat. Something I'd been dreaming about since the children left home 3 years ago. I'd even found a potential property, a large cabin with acreage in Alaska that needed work but had, as the listing said, billion-dollar views and good bones. "I think it could be wonderful," I'd said quietly, passing the charcuterie board that had taken me an hour to arrange. "With the kids grown, we could start fresh, travel, meet new people. I could finally use my hospitality degree." The hospitality degree I'd earned at 38, taking night classes while working part-time and still managing to have dinner on the table every evening by 6:30. The degree I'd never been able to use because someone needed to drive Sophia to ballet or David to his debate team or Michael to soccer practice or James to the airport for another business trip where he'd come home exhausted and expectant, waiting for me to massage the tension from his shoulders and listen to his complaints about demanding clients. "A wilderness retreat," James had said, cutting into his perfectly prepared ham with surgical precision. "With what money, Emily? With what business experience? You've never run anything more complicated than a school bake sale." "I ran the church charity auction for 8 years, I'd said, hating how defensive I sounded. "I organized the community food drive that raised over $75,000. I managed the household budget through 3 recessions and still saved enough to—" "That's not the same as running a business," David had interrupted, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he'd inherited from his father. "Mom, you can't just decide to become an entrepreneur at 64. That's not how the real world works. Besides," Sophia had added, not looking up from her phone where she was undoubtedly posting pictures of my carefully prepared meal to Instagram without credit, "you'd hate dealing with strangers all the time. You're not exactly a people person." "Not a people person." The woman who'd hosted dinner parties for James's law partners for 3 decades, who'd organized neighborhood block parties and school fundraisers and charity galas, who'd been the perfect corporate wife during James's climb up the legal ladder, smiling and making small talk and remembering everyone's names and their children's accomplishments. But I'd learned long ago that my family had a remarkable ability to forget my contributions the moment they were no longer convenient. "It was just an idea," I'd said finally, reaching for my wine glass and noticing how my hand trembled slightly. Something to think about for the future. That's when James had delivered his verdict. Deadweight. And they'd all laughed. Now I stood in the ruins of my Thanksgiving dinner, gravy seeping into the antique rug, while my family continued their meal as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just reduced 35 years of my life to a punchline. "Emily," James said without looking up from his plate, "you gonna clean that up or just stand there all night?" I looked at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in years. James Miller, 67 years old, silver-haired, and still handsome in the way that powerful men with money and confidence often were. The same man who'd swept me off my feet at a college fundraiser in 1985, who'd promised me adventures and partnership and a life full of possibilities. Somewhere along the way, those promises had transformed into expectations. I'd cook, clean, manage, organize, facilitate, and disappear. I'd become the invisible infrastructure that kept his life running smoothly. So invisible that my own family couldn't imagine me as anything else. "Actually, James," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think I'll leave it." I untied my embroidered apron, the one I'd spent hours stitching while watching James's favorite legal dramas, the one that had seemed so festive this morning when I'd put on my good pearl earrings and hoped for a pleasant family dinner. I dropped it on top of the gravy mess. "What the hell is wrong with you?" James's voice carried the sharp edge it got when his routine was disrupted. "That's your grandmother's rug." "Yes, it is." I walked to the coat closet and pulled out my black wool coat, the one I'd bought 3 years ago but rarely wore because James said it made me look like I was trying too hard. "And now it's yours to clean." "Mom." Michael's voice held the first note of uncertainty I'd heard from him all evening. "Where are you going?" I paused at the front door, looking back at my family. They sat around my table under my grandmother's chandelier, in the dining room I decorated and maintained and loved, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their lives by accident. Maybe I was. "I'm going to find out if I'm really dead weight," I said, pulling on the simple leather gloves I'd received last Christmas from Sophia. Practical, brown, forgettable gloves that matched exactly what she thought of me. Or if you've all just forgotten what it feels like to carry yourselves. I walked out into the crisp November evening, leaving the door open behind me so they could hear my car engine starting, could hear me backing out of the driveway of the house I'd called home for 28 years. I drove through our quiet Chicago suburb, where every house was lit with the warm glow of family dinners and football games, where other women my age were probably loading dishwashers and wrapping leftovers and pretending their lives were exactly what they'd always dreamed they would be. But I didn't go to our empty house with its perfectly coordinated throw pillows and spotless kitchen and guest room that was always ready for visitors who rarely came. Instead, I drove to the Westin on the edge of town, checked into a room with a view of the interstate, and sat on the generic hotel bed with my phone in my hands. The texts from James started at 11:30 p.m. "This is ridiculous. Come home. Midnight. Emily, you're embarrassing yourself." At 12:30 a.m. "Fine. Sulk all you want, but you're paying for that hotel room yourself." I turned off my phone and opened my laptop. The property in Alaska was still for sale. I'd been secretly checking the listing every week for 2 months, memorizing the photographs of the wraparound porch and the stone fireplace and the view of the lake that seemed to go on forever. But I hadn't just been looking. I'd been planning. I opened a new browser window and logged into my private banking portal. The inheritance from my parents, the one James assumed I'd spent on groceries and household expenses over the years. He never asked. He didn't think I was capable of managing money. He didn't know that my father, a quiet accountant who'd always believed in my intelligence, had taught me how to invest. He didn't know I'd been carefully growing that inheritance for 15 years. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd found the realtor. By 4 a.m., I'd transferred the full asking price of $380,000 into an escrow account, a cash offer the realtor, a man named William, couldn't refuse. He'd called me, his voice a mix of professional concern and genuine shock. Mrs. Miller, I have to ask, are you certain about this? Purchasing property sight unseen is always risky. But Alaska. It's not exactly retirement country for most people. Mr. Johnson, I'd said, my voice clear and firm. I've spent 35 years making safe decisions. How has that worked out for me? The property is mine as of 9 this morning, correct? Yes, ma'am. Congratulations, I suppose. By sunrise I was driving north. Not towards home. North towards a new life. A life that would finally fit the woman I'd always been underneath the apron and the expectations and the weight of other people's limitations. James was right about one thing. I had been carrying dead weight for 35 years. But it hadn't been me. After the call with William, I sat on the hotel bed and stared at my phone, which I'd reluctantly turned back on. 17 missed calls. Dozens of texts. James's anger had evolved overnight from irritation to outrage to what appeared to be genuine panic. Emily, this has gone far enough. The kids are worried sick. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Just come home. I'm calling Dr. Harrison. You're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Dr. Harrison, our family physician for 20 years, who'd prescribed antidepressants when I'd mentioned feeling invisible, who'd suggested hormone therapy when I'd complained about feeling restless, who'd recommended couples counseling when I dared to voice dissatisfaction with my marriage. Counseling that James had refused, claiming our problems were all in Emily's head. The final text had arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning. Emily, please. I didn't mean what I said. Come home and we'll talk about the retreat idea. I deleted the messages without responding and called a number I'd found online at 2 o'clock in the morning. All American Moving and Storage. This is Noah. I need everything in my house packed and shipped to Alaska. Today. Ma'am, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm sorry, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I meant I need it scheduled for today. I can pay extra for the rush service. Alaska's a big place. Where in Alaska? I gave him the address I'd memorized. He let out a low whistle. That's remote. Gonna cost you extra for the distance. And we'll need to coordinate with a local company up there for the final delivery. Whatever it costs, I said. You moving the whole house? I considered this question, thinking about the dining room set where my family had laughed at me. The king-size bed where James had been falling asleep before I finished speaking for the last 5 years. The living room furniture arranged around a television that played his shows on his schedule. No, I said, a wave of clarity washing over me. Just my things. My books, my clothes, my grandmother's china, my craft supplies, my sewing machine. Everything else stays. What about furniture? I'll buy new furniture. Furniture that fit who I was now, not who I used to be. After scheduling the movers, I drove to our house. My former house, arriving at 7:30 to find James's sedan still in the driveway. He'd taken the day off work, something he'd done exactly 3 times in our entire marriage, when each of our children was born. I used my key quietly, surprised by how foreign my own home felt after just one night away. The gravy stain was gone from the dining room rug. James must have called our expensive cleaning service. But the table still held the remnants of our Thanksgiving disaster. Dirty plates, serving dishes with congealed food, wine glasses with dark residue in the bottom. The scene of my humiliation, left for me to clean up. I found James in the kitchen, standing at the coffee maker in his bathrobe. His silver hair disheveled and his face bearing the kind of hangover pallor that suggested he'd finished the wine after I left. "Thank God," he said when he saw me. "Emily, we need to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand." "Has it?" I opened the cabinet where I kept my travel mugs and selected my favorite, a ceramic piece decorated with vintage maps that Sophia had given me years ago, back when she still thought my dreams of travel were charming rather than embarrassing. Of course it has. Running off to a hotel like a teenager having a tantrum. What will the neighbors think? I poured coffee into my travel mug, adding the cream I'd bought 2 days ago. "I don't know, James. What do you think they'll think?" "I think they'll think my wife has lost her mind." He moved closer, and I caught the familiar scent of his aftershave mixed with stale wine and a new note. Fear. Emily, I know I said some things last night. We all did. But you know how family dinners get. Everyone's tired. Maybe we had too much wine. Dead weight. What? That's what you called me. Dead weight. So it would sound more clever, more cutting. James's face flushed red. I was joking, Emily. It was a joke. You know I didn't mean it. Which part was the joke? The part where you said I'd always been dead weight, or the part where our children laughed about it? They weren't laughing at you, they were. They were laughing at me, James. Just like you've been laughing at me for years. Every time I mention going back to school or starting a business or traveling somewhere that wasn't a pre-planned vacation to the same resort we visited 8 times. I walked past him toward the stairs, heading for the bedroom to collect the personal items the movers would need to identify. Where are you going now? James's voice carried the edge of a man who was accustomed to controlling situations and found himself suddenly powerless. Upstairs. To pack. Pack for what? How long is this little rebellion going to last? I stopped halfway up the stairs, looking down at the man I'd promised to love and honor until death do us part. He stood in our kitchen wearing the silk bathrobe I'd given him for his birthday, surrounded by the breakfast dishes I wouldn't be washing, in the house I'd turned into a home he'd taken completely for granted. It's not a rebellion, James. It's a divorce. The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Emily, you're 64 years old. You can't just start over. Where would you even go? What would you do? I smiled, thinking about 50 acres of untouched wilderness where no one had ever called me dead weight, where no one expected me to disappear into the background of my own life. I'm going to find out what it feels like to be the main character in my own story. This is insane. You don't have any money, any skills, any. I have $422,000 in my personal account, a hospitality degree, 35 years of management experience, and more skills than you've ever bothered to notice. James's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. 400. How do you have? My parents' inheritance. The money you assumed didn't exist because you never asked about it. The money I've been investing while you've been treating me like unpaid household staff. I climbed the rest of the stairs, leaving James standing in his expensive kitchen, finally understanding that the woman he'd taken for granted was about to take herself completely out of his reach. In our bedroom, I pulled out the suitcase I'd bought years ago for a trip to Italy that never happened because James decided it was too expensive, too impractical, too much trouble. Now it would carry me 6,000 miles away from everything I'd ever known. The movers arrived at noon, efficient and professional, packing my life into labeled boxes while James made increasingly desperate phone calls to our children. I heard fragments of his conversations, explanations about midlife crises and hormonal changes and the need for family intervention. But I also heard something I'd never heard before. Genuine fear that I might actually mean what I said. By evening, my possessions were loaded onto a truck heading north. By midnight, I was on a plane to Anchorage, watching the lights of Chicago disappear beneath the clouds. Somewhere over the Canadian border, I opened my laptop and began researching sustainable building practices, ecotourism, and the hospitality industry in Alaska. Dead weight didn't research. Dead weight didn't plan. Dead weight didn't spend the flight designing the life she was going to build from scratch. But Emily Miller was about to prove that she'd been carrying everyone else for so long. She'd forgotten how light she could be on her own. The bush pilot who flew me from Anchorage to my new property looked like he'd been carved from the Alaskan wilderness itself. Grizzled beard, eyes the color of a frozen lake, and hands that gripped the controls of his tiny Cessna as if it were a natural extension of his own body. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he shouted over the engine's roar as we banked over an endless expanse of forest and mountain. "Weather's turning, and that cabin's been empty a long while. Might wanna consider staying in town tonight, headin' out in the morning." Below us stretched a landscape that seemed to exist beyond the reach of human ambition. Mountains rose like ancient gods against a sky the color of pewter, their peaks crowned with snow that had never known a human footprint. Rivers snaked through valleys where the only roads were game trails, where silence wasn't broken by traffic or sirens or the constant hum of a civilization demanding your attention. "I'm sure," I called back, my knuckles white as I clutched the armrest. "I've been waiting my whole life to be sure about something." He gave me a look that suggested he'd transported his share of people running from their lives, and most of them hadn't lasted a single winter. But he just nodded and began his descent toward a clearing that seemed impossibly small from the air, barely more than a scratch in the vast green and gold canvas of the autumn forest. The landing was rougher than anything I'd experienced in 30 years of vacation flights to predictable, manicured destinations. The plane bucked and jolted down what I generously supposed was a runway, finally shuddering to a stop in front of a log cabin that looked as if it had grown from the surrounding forest, built by someone who understood that true beauty didn't require ornamentation. "That's her," the pilot David said, cutting the engine. "Home sweet home." The cabin was larger than the photographs had suggested. 2 stories of weathered logs with enormous windows that reflected the surrounding wilderness like mirrors. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides, and I could see the bones of what had once been a garden, now overgrown with wild grasses and late-season fireweed. But it was the lake that stole my breath. 50 yards from the cabin's front door, the water stretched toward the horizon like liquid silver, so still and perfect it seemed to hold the sky captive in its depths. Mountains rose directly from the far shore, their reflection creating a world that existed both above and below the surface, real and mirrored, possible and impossible. "Previous owner was an author," David said, helping me unload my single suitcase. "Came up here to finish some big novel. Stayed 15 years. Only left when his arthritis got too bad for the winters." "Did he finish it?" "The novel? Heard he wrote 12 of 'em," David said with a gruff chuckle. Something about the solitude clearing his head, helping him remember who he was underneath all the noise. I stood in front of my new home. My home. Purchased with my money. Chosen by my judgment. And I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Possibility. David fired up his engine. "I can come back tomorrow, check on you, make sure you're settling in all right." "That's kind of you, but it's unnecessary," I said, my voice firm. "I have everything I need." He studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of the breakdown James was probably describing to anyone who would listen. Instead, he seemed to find something that surprised him. "You know what, ma'am?" he said with a half-smile. "I think you do." After he lifted off, the silence was so complete it felt like a living thing. No traffic, no sirens, no televisions bleeding through thin walls, no family members needing rides or meals or emotional management. No husband's voice explaining why my dreams were impractical, why my desires were selfish, why my very existence was an inconvenience. Just the wind in the pines and the gentle lap of water against the lakeshore and the sound of my own breathing, steady and calm and entirely my own. I walked through the cabin slowly, claiming each room with my presence. The author had left it furnished with simple, sturdy pieces that looked like they'd been built to last through whatever storms Alaska could deliver. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by built-in bookshelves that begged to be filled with stories that mattered. The kitchen was small but functional, with huge windows that looked out over the lake and mountains that seemed to change color as the light shifted. Upstairs, the master bedroom occupied the entire second floor, with windows on 3 sides and a view that made my Chicago suburban horizon seem cramped and apologetic. This was a room for dreaming big dreams, for planning impossible things, for becoming whoever you were brave enough to become. I unpacked my laptop and sat at the solid wood kitchen table, using my phone's hotspot to connect to the outside world. The internet was slow, but it was functional enough for research, for planning, for the empire I was already beginning to envision. My inbox was full of increasingly frantic messages from James and the children, but I deleted them unread. That conversation would happen when I was ready, on my terms, from a position of strength rather than desperation. Instead, I opened a new document and began typing. Business plan. Aurora Peak Lodge. Mission. To to provide discerning travelers with an authentic Alaska experience that combines luxury accommodation with environmental stewardship and a deep respect for local culture. Target market: executives seeking a digital detox, couples celebrating significant anniversaries, adventure travelers who appreciate high-end comfort, corporate groups needing creative inspiration. I'd studied hospitality management for 6 years, earning my degree while raising 3 children and maintaining a household that could have served as a magazine spread for perfect family living. I'd managed budgets, coordinated events, resolved conflicts, and created experiences that brought people together around shared values. Everything James had dismissed as just housework had actually been preparation for this. By midnight, I had 30 pages of detailed plans. Renovations that would transform the cabin into a luxury lodge while preserving its authentic character. Marketing strategies that would attract guests willing to pay premium prices for authentic experiences. Partnerships with local guides, artisans, and suppliers that would benefit the entire community. A sustainable business model that would provide financial independence while creating something genuinely meaningful. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I hadn't covered with the heavy drapes James preferred. Outside, the lake reflected clouds that looked like brush strokes against canvas, and I understood why the writer had stayed for 15 years. I made coffee in the simple kitchen and walked onto the porch, breathing air so clean it seemed to wash my lungs from the inside. A bald eagle circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the haunting call of a loon. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, James's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while watching the eagle settle on a dead pine at the water's edge. Emily, this has gone too far. The kids are worried sick. The neighbors are asking questions, and Dr. Harrison says you might be having a genuine psychological break. I've talked to a lawyer about having you declared. Well, about protecting you from making decisions you'll regret. Just come home. We'll pretend this never happened. I deleted the message and blocked his number. Then I called the construction company I'd researched online, the one with 5-star ratings and a specialty in sustainable building practices. Northern Built. This is Ava. Her voice was clear and no nonsense. I'd like to schedule a consultation for a major renovation project, I said. I'm turning a residential cabin into a luxury wilderness lodge. Whereabouts are you located? I gave her the address, hearing her whistle softly through the phone. That's pretty remote. It'll cost extra to get crews and materials out there. That's fine, I said, a thrill running through me. This was real. When can someone come take a look? How about next Tuesday? Fair warning though. Winter's coming fast up there. If you want to do any major work, we'd need to start soon and work through some pretty challenging weather. Perfect, I said, a smile spreading across my face. I've been dealing with challenging weather my whole life. It's time I built something that can withstand it. After scheduling the consultation, I walked down to the lakeshore and stood at the water's edge, letting the morning silence wash over me like absolution. Somewhere in Chicago, James was probably calling lawyers and doctors, trying to find legal ways to drag me back to a life that had never fit. But legal guardianship required proving I was incompetent to make my own decisions. And a woman who had just purchased 50 acres of Alaska wilderness, developed a comprehensive business plan, and scheduled major construction work within 48 hours of arriving didn't sound particularly incompetent. She sounded like someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. The eagle took flight, circling once before disappearing into the vast blue sky. I had work to do. The construction crew arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost painted the world in silver, their convoy of trucks rumbling down my dirt access road like mechanical thunder. I watched from my kitchen window as they unloaded equipment and materials, these men and women who would help transform my vision into reality. Ava Santos emerged from the lead truck, a compact woman in her 50s with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing. She walked the property with the focused attention of someone who understood that Alaska didn't forgive poor planning or shoddy workmanship. "You picked a hell of a place to build a business," she said, studying the elevation reports I'd already commissioned and emailed to her. "But I'll give you this. The location's perfect for what you're planning. Total privacy, world-class views, and just close enough to town that you won't go completely feral. We spent the morning walking through the cabin, discussing load-bearing walls and plumbing upgrades, and the kind of insulation that would keep guests comfortable when outside temperatures dropped below survival. Ava's team measured and photographed and made notes in the efficient shorthand of people who built things that lasted. "Timeline's tight if you want to open next summer," she said as we stood on the porch looking out at the lake, where ice was already forming along the edges. "We're talking about adding 4 guest suites, upgrading the electrical and plumbing systems, building a commercial-grade kitchen, and constructing a separate spa building. That's a lot of work in a short window. Can it be done? Can be done. The question is whether you want to pay what it'll cost to do it right." I thought about the account statements I'd reviewed that morning. The careful investments that had grown steadily while James made jokes about my pin money. The inheritance from parents who'd believed in education and self-sufficiency, who'd worked 2 jobs each to send me to college, who'd trusted me to make something meaningful of the opportunities they'd provided. "Money isn't the limiting factor," I said. "Quality is." Ava smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "In that case, we can absolutely do this. But you're gonna have to make some decisions about living arrangements. This place is going to be a construction zone for the next 8 months. I'd been thinking about this problem since my first night in the cabin. Staying would mean months of noise, dust, and constant disruption. Leaving would mean returning to Chicago, probably triggering exactly the kind of intervention James was threatening. What if I built something temporary? A small cabin where I could stay during construction. "Could work," Ava said, pulling out a tablet and sketching quickly. "Keep you close enough to make decisions, but far enough away to maintain some sanity. We could put up a kit cabin down by the lake. Nothing fancy but warm and functional. Tear it down when the main project's finished, or keep it as staff quarters. How long would that take to build? 2 weeks, maybe 3. We'd need to pour a foundation and run utilities, but it's straightforward work." I looked at the spot she'd indicated, a level area about 100 yards from the main cabin with an unobstructed view of the water. Private enough for solitude, close enough for supervision. Perfect for a woman learning to live entirely on her own terms. "Let's do it." That afternoon, while Ava's crew began laying out foundation markers, I drove my newly delivered rental truck into town for supplies. Prospect Creek, population 847 according to the welcome sign, consisted of a grocery store, a hardware store, a gas station, and a combination cafe bar called the Salty Salmon that appeared to serve as the community's unofficial city hall. The grocery store clerk, a kindly woman with practical gray hair, helped me navigate the complexities of shopping for an extended stay in rural Alaska. "You're the one bought the Morrison place," she said, not quite making it a question. "Word travels fast," I said with a smile. "Honey, in a town this size, a stranger buying property is front-page news. Especially when she shows up alone and starts talking about building a resort." I paused in loading canned goods into my cart. "Is that a problem?" The clerk considered this, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd lived through enough winters to recognize genuine determination. "Depends what kind of resort you're planning. We've seen folks come through wanting to build casinos or strip malls or turn the whole place into some kind of Disneyland North. Nothing like that," I said earnestly. "I want to create a place where people can experience the real Alaska, the wilderness, the culture, the sense of possibility. Something that supports the community rather than exploiting it. And you think you can do that, coming from—" She glanced at my Illinois license plates, visible through the window. "Coming from somewhere flat and easy." It was a fair question. I thought about my 35 years of managing complexity, resolving conflicts, and creating experiences that brought out the best in people. About the fundraisers I'd organized that had fed families and funded scholarships and built community centers. About the dinner parties where I'd helped strangers become friends, where I'd subtly negotiated business deals disguised as social conversations, where I'd turned my home into a space that made people feel valued and heard. "I think I can learn," I said. "And I think I can listen to people who know more than I do." The clerk nodded slowly, then reached under the counter and pulled out a business card. My niece runs the best guiding service in the area. If you're serious about this resort idea, you'll need local partners who understand what tourists want and what the land can handle. I took the card, reading the name. Wild North Adventures. Emma Morrison, owner. Any relation to the man who sold me the property? His daughter. She grew up on your land. Knows every trail and fishing spot for 50 miles. Smart girl, good business sense. But she's been struggling since her dad moved south. Tourists usually book through the big companies in Anchorage. Don't know there's local expertise available. That evening, I called Emma Morrison from my nearly finished temporary cabin, while construction noise echoed from the main lodge. She agreed to meet the next morning, her voice carrying the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned not to expect too much but hadn't given up hoping. She arrived at sunrise, driving a pickup truck that had seen hard use but careful maintenance. Emma was about Sophia's age, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the deep forest. She moved through the wilderness like it was her living room, pointing out wildlife signs and explaining the seasonal patterns that would affect any tourism operation. Dad always said this property had resort potential, she said as we walked the shoreline. Perfect access to fishing, hiking, wildlife viewing. But it would need to be done right. Small scale, respectful, focused on the experience rather than just extracting money from tourists. That's exactly what I have in mind. We spent the morning discussing partnerships, profit sharing, and the kind of authentic experiences that would justify premium pricing. Emma knew where to find the best fishing, which trails offered the most spectacular views, how to track and photograph wildlife without disturbing natural behaviors. I have one condition, she said as we walked back toward the cabin. Any business we build here, it supports the community. Local hiring, local suppliers, local culture. Too many outside developers come in and turn Alaska into a theme park version of itself. Agreed, I said without hesitation. I want to create something that belongs here, not something that could exist anywhere. Emma studied my face, looking for the kind of insincerity she'd probably encountered from other outsiders with big dreams and small understanding. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. All right then, she said, extending a calloused hand. Let's build something worth building. As she drove away, I stood on the porch of my tiny temporary home, watching the sun paint the lake in shades of gold and copper. My phone had been buzzing with ignored calls all morning. James's number, the children's numbers, even Dr. Harrison's office. But I'd also received emails from my investment advisor confirming my portfolio had grown by another 8% this quarter. From Ava the contractor confirming that construction was ahead of schedule. From the Small Business Administration approving my application for additional funding. Deadweight didn't get approved for business loans. Deadweight didn't negotiate partnerships with local experts. Deadweight didn't stand on her own porch, watching her dreams take shape in the wilderness she'd claimed as her own. I was beginning to understand what the writer who'd lived here for 15 years had discovered. Sometimes you had to travel to the edge of the world to find the center of yourself. The loons called across the water, their voices carrying promises I was finally ready to believe. Winter arrived like a judgment, swift and absolute and more beautiful than anything I'd experienced in 6 decades of predictable Chicago seasons. By February, the lake was a white highway stretching toward mountains that seemed carved from crystal, and my temporary cabin had become a cocoon of warmth and purpose in a world transformed by a profound, magnificent silence. The main construction had slowed but never stopped. Ava's crew, with a kind of grit that seemed uniquely Alaskan, worked in shifts through the harsh weather, their progress a steady, reassuring drumbeat against the quiet of the wilderness. Inside my temporary cabin, I spent the long, dark months planning, researching, and learning the hospitality business with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. I devoured books on marketing, sustainable tourism, and Alaskan ecology. I designed menus, drafted employee handbooks, and mapped out guest experiences down to the smallest detail. Emma stopped by twice a week, bringing groceries and mail on her snowmobile, and the kind of practical wisdom that only came from surviving 40 winters in the bush. She'd become something I'd never had in Chicago, a true friend who valued my mind rather than my domestic services. She taught me how to read the ice on the lake, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, and how to stay warm when the temperature dropped to 20 below. She never once asked me about my old life, only about the future I was building. "Package from Chicago," she said one bitter February afternoon, stamping snow off her boots as she entered my small warm kitchen. "Looks official." The box was substantial, professionally packed with James's law firm's return address. I'd been expecting this. Inside, beneath layers of legal padding, were divorce papers. But not the simple dissolution I'd filed through my own attorney in Anchorage. This was a complex, brutal document filled with accusations and demands. James was contesting everything. My competency to make financial decisions, my right to our community property, even my legal residence in Alaska. Attached was a letter in his familiar, arrogant handwriting. "Emily, this foolishness has gone on long enough. I've spoken to medical professionals who confirm that your recent behavior indicates possible early-stage dementia or a serious psychological break. No rational person abandons their family and their life savings to play pioneer in the wilderness. I am prepared to file for legal guardianship if you don't return immediately and submit to a proper medical evaluation. The children support this decision. We are all very worried about you." Emma watched me read, her expression darkening as she absorbed the shift in my body language. "Bad news. My husband," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "wants to have me declared mentally incompetent." She whistled low, a sound of disbelief and anger. "On what grounds?" "Apparently, buying property in Alaska and starting a business constitutes clear evidence of dementia." "Well, hell," Emma said, pouring herself coffee without asking. "Another thing I loved about our easy friendship. Half the state would be in asylums if that were true." She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "What are you gonna do?" I thought about the question while watching the snow fall outside my windows like a blessing, each flake a tiny piece of the new world I was creating. In Chicago, this moment would have triggered panic, frantic phone calls to lawyers, desperate attempts to prove my sanity to people who'd already decided I'd lost it. The old Emily would have rushed home to make peace, to smooth over the conflict, to resume the smaller version of herself that everyone found so much more comfortable. But the woman who'd lived through an Alaskan winter, who'd negotiated construction contracts and built partnerships and learned to split firewood when the generator failed, had different responses available. "I'm going to prove him wrong," I said, my voice hardening into something that felt like steel. "How?" I walked over to the sturdy trunk where I kept my most important documents. I pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for months, a collection of evidence that would make James's accusations look not just false, but utterly ridiculous. Bank statements showing my assets had grown substantially under my own management. The comprehensive business plan that demonstrated strategic thinking and meticulous market analysis. Letters from contractors, suppliers, and partners attesting to my competency and professionalism. "He thinks I'm hiding in the woods, making emotional, irrational decisions," I said, spreading the documents across my small kitchen table. "The paper evidence of my sanity. Instead, I've been building something that will be worth millions when it opens." Emma studied the papers with the careful attention of someone who understood business. Her guiding service had survived and grown through careful planning and sound judgment, and she recognized the same qualities in my work. "This is solid," she said finally, her voice filled with respect. "Really solid. You've thought through everything. Environmental impact, staffing, marketing, seasonal variations. This is not the work of someone who's lost her mind." "No," I agreed. "It isn't. But fighting this kind of thing costs money and energy. You sure you want to get dragged into a legal battle instead of focusing on the business?" I thought about James's letter, about his arrogant assumption that threatening me with a medical evaluation and guardianship would send me scurrying home in fear. About 35 years of backing down from conflicts, apologizing for inconveniencing people with my existence, making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort. "Emma, I've been avoiding conflict my whole life," I said, my gaze meeting hers. "It never made anything better." Just postpone the reckoning. If James wants a legal fight, he can have one. But he's about to discover that the woman he married isn't the woman he's trying to control. That afternoon, I drove into town through snow that fell like a promise of purity, meeting with the lawyer I'd retained when I first arrived in Alaska. Sophia Chan was a sharp, focused woman about my daughter's age, with the fierce intelligence of someone who'd built her practice defending people others underestimated. Natives fighting for land.